Today I would like to talk to you about one of my all-time favorite plants, Alocasia cuprea. Now when I got her 5 years ago, she looked nothing like that. Actually, she looked like this. And over the last 5 years, I learned a lot about caring for this plant. And that's what I want to share with you in today's video. But before I share with you all of my tips and tricks about caring for this plant, I want to talk about its origin, its features, as well as its preferred growing conditions, so that by the end of the video, you've got everything you need to know to grow Alocasia cuprea. Hello everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I don't really know how to frame this video. This plant is quite a large plant. I think it's pretty easy to see why I love this plant so much. Besides the fact that it is a plant that I've had for such a long time, it was really one of the first plants in my plant collection, so it has a little bit of sentimental value. This plant just looks beautiful from all sides. I mean, I do love the red backs over here, but we're going to talk about the features of the plant in a second. It is also just the Alocasia that I have had the best time with. It seems to be, at least for me, the easiest Alocasia to grow, and I've had great success with her over the last 5 years. First things first, let's start off with the origin, so we really understand where this plant naturally thrives, so that we can hopefully learn from that environment and try and replicate that indoors. Alocasia cuprea is an aroid native to Borneo. The Borneo rainforest is estimated to be around 140 million years old, making it one of the oldest rainforests in the world. And it's not just one of the oldest ones, it's also one of the most biodiverse rainforests in the world. The climate is very warm and tropical. They have almost 4,000 millimeters of rainfall annually. Temperatures ranging between 27 to 32 degrees Celsius and relative humidity of around about 80%. So tropical. To be honest, when I looked this up, I couldn't actually find where exactly within Borneo this plant is native to, so I couldn't pinpoint the exact climate. Not the whole island is rainforest, and even within a rainforest, you know, you can have high altitude, which comes with cooler temperatures, lower altitude, which comes at warmer temperatures. So I couldn't pinpoint exactly where this plant is native from within Borneo, but it might actually just be distributed across the whole island. I'm not too sure, but overall, Borneo is warm and tropical with very high humidity and high rainfall. Maybe I take it out of the pot so we're making less noise, because I think the pot was a bit noisy. Now, I don't even really know which side to show you, because I think all of the side of this display looks so good. But basically, Alocasia cuprea is known for the leaves kind of looking a little bit alien, or some people describe it as a turtle shell, or like a brain almost. They look a little bit alien, definitely very prehistoric, and they have this sort of coppery color to them. I do believe that's where cuprea comes from. And then they have these burgundy, almost purple undersides. Now, when we're talking about the red coloration, I found a lot of confusing information online. There's also a cultivar called Red Secret, and a lot of the things I read online about Red Secret was basically saying that it's a cultivar of cuprea. The Red Secret has redder leaves. Some say that the Red Secret has pointier leaves. Some said that the Red Secret is smaller than the cuprea. Most of these statements came from websites that then try and sell you the Red Secret as well as the cuprea. So, you know, I'm always doubtful when I hear sellers make these sort of statements, because it could also just be an upselling technique to sell you the same plant twice. When we're talking about any plants, of course there's always differences. It could be differences to just the growing conditions that they're growing in. That doesn't make it a completely different cultivar, definitely doesn't make it a completely different species. There was one Facebook post out of all things, and I don't really like to quote Facebook pages as a source, because, you know, everybody can write whatever they want on Facebook, and I put a photo up that they posted as well. They were saying that the real difference between Red Secret, which is a cultivar of cuprea, is actually the color of the inflows. Red Secret has red inflows, whereas cuprea has more greenish inflows. Mine definitely has green inflows, so I do believe it's just a normal cuprea species. But I think where a lot of the confusion comes from is that when this plant matures, the leaves start being a little bit more green, right? Like these leaves from the front just look green, right? From the back, they're still purple. However, the same plant, when juvenile, this one is definitely more red, right? If you compare this juvenile leaf to this leaf over here, we can see that this juvenile leaf is more red than the mature leaf. So from my experience and further research, it seems to be quite normal that when Alocasia cuprea matures, it goes more green, metallic, rather than having this red, almost copper color at the front. The backsides don't really change. So I think the plant changing with maturity, which is very common with plants by the way, is adding to the confusion. So you could see a small plant with more red in the front and a large plant that looks more green and assume that they're two different cultivars. One is the red form and one is the green form, when really it's the same plant just matured. At the end of the day, I could find very, very little reliable information about it online. So for the sake of today's video, let's just assume that they're all the same. At the end of the day, the only recognized species, I believe, is Alocasia cuprea. So let's keep running with that. But I wanted to address it because it has come up in the comment section a few times. And I have been asked about it before as well. Is Alocasia cuprea Alocasia Red Secret? And I do believe that sometimes it's also just used as a common name for Alocasia cuprea because it is reddish, right? Yeah, I mean, these backsides with the red are absolutely stunning. So I could understand why somebody would want to call this Red Secret. And that red color, I'm just spinning it around because I don't know which side looks the best. So I'm going to give you all of them. And that red color also is very dominant when the plant is pushing out a new leaf, like over here. Well, that's because you see the underside. The other thing about its feature is that it's not a climber. I usually love my climbers and I love putting them on moss piles, but the cuprea is definitely an exception, and that goes for all alocasias. Alocasias are clumping plants. They have a clumping growth pattern, right? Like they all come from a rhizome that's somewhere within the pot, and then they just start shooting out from the center. They do not climb with elongated internodal spacing. They don't have aerial roots to attach to a host tree or something like that. They grow from within the pot. And I mean, you can see this over here, right? Yes, the rhizomes over time can be elongated and kind of grow out of the pot. I mean, look at this one, for example. And yes, over here you can then see root growth, which I'm trying to funnel into the pot via moss. But these are not aerial roots that would normally like to attach to a tree host. That is just how they grow. If they grow too large, sometimes they just flop over and then they start rooting wherever they just fell. Absolutely no moss pile required. It's definitely a question I get asked quite frequently. Can I put my Alocasia on a moss pile? And I would actually absolutely love that. I think it would look stunning to have these sort of leaves climbing left, right, up a moss pile. I think that would be really nice, but we gotta grow with nature, not against nature. So this one does not need a moss pile. But we're gonna talk about the care and how I recommend you grow it in a second. And from what I've heard online is that these leaves can actually grow up to 60 centimeters in length. Let's have a look at how large my largest one is. Okay, this is 60 centimeters. I think this could be the largest leaf that I've got. That's at 41. So they could be significantly larger than what I have. Keep in mind the 60 centimeter is probably only achieved in the rainforest, maybe in a greenhouse, but probably very, very hard to achieve in an indoor setting. But I think I'm more than happy with how this plant has grown so far. Now that we know more about where the plant comes from and how the plant naturally likes to grow and its features, let's talk about how we can make this plant thrive in our indoor setting. First, let's talk about the conditions that we should aim for when growing this plant. Temperatures, we can aim for a range anything between 12 degrees Celsius and like 30 degrees Celsius. I think hotter than that, it will be hard to keep the humidity up on top of that. Lower than that, you might induce dormancy, but I mean, realistically, whose house is warmer than 30 degrees or whose house is colder than 12 degrees? I think the Health Organization recommends nothing under 18 or 19 degrees for humans. So I always aim for about 22, but in summer it can definitely get a little bit warmer. It is near an east-facing window. I reckon temporarily it can easily go up to like 30 degrees over there when the morning sun hits it, but obviously not all day, every day. It definitely doesn't really go below 20 degrees or so in my house. So I reckon if you're aiming for a moderate, like 22 degrees or so, this plant will be just fine. The plant naturally grows up in a really high humidity environment, so it certainly appreciates a high humidity environment, but because it's quite thick and leathery, I actually find this to be the easier Alocasia out of all of the ones I really tried. So I think if you have like 50% humidity, this plant is still going to be just fine. I never really had any like low humidity induced issues with this plant, but my humidity is always around 50 to 60%. When it's really rainy, the humidity can be through the roof over here. It's been raining for 5 days straight, and right now the humidity is 85%. But we can also have really dry weeks where suddenly the humidity is at 35, right? So if we're averaging that out again, I reckon between 50 to 60% humidity, you'll be just fine. If you're trying to grow a tropical rainforest plant in 10-15 degrees humidity, that's obviously going to be a bit of an issue, but that is not necessarily specific to just Alocasia cuprea. I think you're going to face that struggle with any plant that is a tropical plant. And then most importantly, this plant really enjoys bright light. I do not give this plant any direct sun. I don't think it has ever really gotten any direct sun. And if you want to give your plant direct sun, I would recommend it is just the early morning sun or the really late afternoon sun, maybe a little bit of winter sun, but I would definitely avoid really harsh summer sun. This is an understory plant. It grows in a tropical rainforest. The trees take up most of the direct sun, and then they get bright, indirect dappled light down there, right? So you don't want to give it too much light, but you also don't want it to be too dark. I personally have the best time facilitating that bright indirect light with a grow light, and this one, because it's such a beast, actually has its very own grow light. I'll show you a setup via B-roll. It is under a Soltec Vita light bulb, and ever since I put it under that light bulb about 6 months ago, this plant has absolutely exploded. It's just a much more consistent way of providing bright indirect light rather than having to rely on Mother Nature. For example, the last 5 days have been really rainy and overcast, so it's been very, very dark inside. If I rely on just natural light, none of my plants in here would currently get sufficient natural light because my house is quite dark. However, if it's a sunny day, I also have had plants burn in my house because the sun through the window just hitting the leaf that is maybe not used to that much sun. If you're relying on natural light, you have to move your plant around to make sure that as the seasons change, as the day changes and so on, you're not exposing your plant to too much light, but also not too little light. With a somewhat finicky plant like this one, and or plant that I really, really want to see thrive, I always have the best time facilitating bright indirect light via a grow light. And I have that grow light linked in the description for you guys as well. Obviously, it's achievable with natural light. That's how they grow in nature. But I find it really hard to facilitate in an indoor setting, especially if you have so many other plants as well, right? They can't all be in that one window that you might have. Okay, so now we kind of understand the growing conditions, the temperature, the humidity range, and the light that we're aiming for. Let's talk about the care. Let's start off with the potting soil. And this plant has actually been in this particular pot and this particular soil for 3 years. So the pot is a little bit dirty. You can't really see much in there. Well, you can definitely see the roots though. Let's have a look. Look at all of the roots. Now it looks somewhat root bound, right? But in comparison to the size of the plant, it's actually a really small, somewhat disappointing root system. And I specifically noticed that with the last repot, that was about 3 years ago. I'll insert a photo over here. The plant was reasonably large at that time already, but when and I don't know why I did that, I stripped the roots bare as part of the repot. I was actually really shocked at how small the root system is for such a large plant. I would have expected more roots. Regardless, I potted it up and I was a little bit nervous because I was like, oh my god, I think I did way too harsh of a repot. I should have not stripped the roots bare like that. But it was just fine. She's a trooper. She didn't mind at all, didn't skip a beat, and continuously thrived. Now, I don't necessarily recommend it. I think where you can, be a little more gentle on the roots, but it obviously didn't harm the plant. But yeah, it is somewhat of a disappointing root system, or quite small root system compared to the size of the plant that it's supporting. So this 20cm pot, while it's somewhat root bound, like, it's been in here for 3 years, and I'm not planning on repotting it for at least the next 4 months while we're going through winter. I would definitely recommend repotting an Alocasia, not just a cuprea, any of them at the beginning of spring or during the warmer part of the year, so the plant has a better time dealing with the shock. Now the mix in itself, sorry, I got a bit distracted. The mix in itself is my aeroid mix. Now 3 years ago, I made my aeroid mix slightly different to the way that I make it today. Actually, and throughout the 3 years, I continuously make my aeroid mix different, depending on what I have. But if I'm correct, it looks like I just started experimenting with pumice when I got this. It looks like a fairly pumice-heavy aeroid mix. So there is bark, pumice, perlite, cocoa chips, and I think cocoa peat would have been the water-retentive component. These days, I prefer using tree fern fiber as the water-retentive component. With the aeroid mix, there's so many different ways of putting it together. At the end of the day, you're aiming for a balance between having aeration and drainage and water retention. Obviously, the whole point of a potting mix is for the plant to grow roots into the potting mix and then absorb water and nutrients via the roots from the substrate. So if you have no water retention, kind of defeats the purpose. So the water retention is the cocoa peat or the tree fern fiber, but at the same time, specifically with alocasias, you're running risk of root rot. You want this pot to drain really well. When you water your mix, you don't want your mix to hold on to all of that water. You want the water to kind of flush through. Yes, the components will absorb a little bit of water, but you don't want it to be sitting in a really boggy, soggy soil mixture. As a result of that, I water quite frequently. Now, of course, 3 years ago, when I repotted this plant and it was maybe a third of the size, but in the same pot with the same potting medium, I water less frequently. Over the last 3 years, I gradually increased the watering frequency. Not the volume. When I water thoroughly and let all of the excess drain through, but I now do that almost every 3 days, because obviously there's a lot of plant to be supported by this little pot. The little pot is getting more and more root bound, which means that there's less medium that actually can retain the moisture, so I'm doing more frequent watering over here. When it comes to watering, there isn't a schedule. You always have got to assess how big is the plant, how big is the pot, how much water requirement does the plant have, and so on. But one thing is the same: you do not want your alocasias to dry out. I think sometimes that's a tip we give to beginners, because you're more likely to introduce issues by overwatering than you are by underwatering, but ideally you don't do either. I personally have had many overwatering issues with alocasias and root rot and so on, but never with my cuprea, so touch wood. Now, a little trick over here: I have a pot in here, for example, and then I have a takeaway container, and then I put the pot in here. So when I water, I don't actually need to take the plant out of that specific pot. Now, I only recently put her in that pot, but the reason I did that is because she's getting so large, I'm trying to avoid moving her if I don't absolutely have to. So with that setup, what I can do is I can just water the plant without moving her, and any of the excess water is just going to drain into the pot over here. It's actually going to give the whole environment a bit of a humidity boost, but the plant isn't sitting in water, but I can still liberally water without having to worry and or it turning into a lot of work for me. So definitely can recommend a setup like that for your alocasias. But I've recently also experimented a lot with growing alocasias in moss. There are lots and lots of pups in here, so I think with the next repot in spring, I will separate one out, and I would love to grow an Alocasia cuprea in just moss with a little leca reservoir instead, because that's worked really well for me for other alocasias. But then at the same time, why fix what's not broken? Clearly, she's loving the way that I'm currently growing her, so why change that? Let's talk about all of these little pups, and let's talk about propagation in general. I've never propagated this plant. This plant has done all of this by itself, and I think I'm going to take you closer with my phone because it's getting a little bit too heavy for me to move this around. So you can see this is the main stem, right? This is the main plant, blah, blah, blah. At some stage, the main plant actually split. This used to be here. It's split into this bit and this bit. And now this is the main plant, which then also split again. There's one growth point here, this brown bit, here under the brown bit. This one. And there's a growth point over here. So this plant, the main plant itself, has now 3 shoots. Hang on, is this one 2? Yeah. 1, 2, and 3. While we're here, let's also address the moss over here. I am worried about this actually snapping because it's getting really heavy and leaning. And if it snaps, it would be unrooted. So what I've done is I put a little layer of moss over here so that I trigger roots like this one from the rhizome to actually then grow into the moss and then from the moss into the pot. So I'm basically air layering this plant. Air layering is usually something that we can do with climbers and so on. I'm just air layering this within the pot so that when I'm ready to propagate this potentially, somewhere down there within the moss layer, I could make a cut. This plant then already has roots within the moss and the pot, and I could pot this back up, and then I'm stuck with a stump in the pot, right? So it's just kind of like increasing the root media for this plant without giving it a larger pot, because again, I'm waiting for spring. Oh my God, so cute. Now, on top of it splitting in the main shoot, it has also grown this. It's not even a pup anymore, it's like a full-blown plant over here. I mean, this is a second plant. This is not part of the main shoot, basically. It has also grown this separate plant over here with this growth point, that one over here, and then it's growing all of these little pups everywhere, right? Here, this one, I mean, it's also not that little. Here, and so on. So it just keeps propagating itself. Now I think some of these little pups you see down here, there would have been corms that sprouted, but most of the time it actually just split and then, you know, had 2 growth points. Definitely not mad at that at all, but I do think with the next repot I might have to separate one out, but don't worry, as I mentioned, I already have plans for the one that I want to separate out. So that is great news for us from a care perspective. It means this is not a candidate for very frequent repotting. That's good, we like that. Less work, less resources that need to go into it and so on. But if you have a substrate that by now is 3 years old, you're also running risk of not providing enough nutrients, which leads me to the next point, nutrient provision. Alocasias, in general, are quite heavy feeders. So I feed with every watering, despite the fact that I'm increasing my watering frequency these days. Well, I'm increasing the watering frequency because there's also more plant. So more plant might also then need more nutrients. So I provide a week dilution, that's about 3 milliliters per liter of water, of Growth Technology Australia Foliage Focus. And I do that with pretty much every watering. Like once a month or so, I'm also putting her in the rain outside, and then she gets a nice clean, and obviously the pot also then gets a little flush. You also can over fertilize, and you can notice that by potentially having mineral buildups on the plant, specifically where the petiole meets the leaf. You can sometimes see a little bit of mineral buildup over there. That could be a sign of over fertilizing. The plant aborting growth could be a sign of over fertilizing and so on. But I think with alocasias, I would say it's a fairly low risk, especially if you provide a weak dilution in the first place. But if you're concerned, once a month, take it into the bathtub, shower, garden, wherever, and just flush it through thoroughly with just plain water. And then you can also use that opportunity to wipe the leaves. Clean leaves can have a better time at photosynthesizing, so that's good for the plant. And also clean leaves help the plant stay on top of pests. As with all alocasias, spider mites love them just as much as I do. I do have to say that actually the cuprea is probably out of all the plants the least spider mite magnety, but still better safe than sorry. So taking it outside and just cleaning the leaves, hosing them down, also ensures that you're not suddenly surprised by a ginormous spider mite infestation. This plant, as much as most of the alocasias I've ever grown, loves to flower. I've had up to 5-6 inflows in a row with this plant. Now when I did my research, I found opposing information about it. Some people say that, well, once the plant grows the inflow and has decided to grow the inflow, the plant has already put all of its energy into it. So chopping it off isn't really going to do anything but trigger the plant to grow yet another inflow instead. Other people say cut off the inflow so that the plant doesn't spend any further energy into growing the inflow. The inflows are very disappointing looking. They're just a normal aeroid inflow. You definitely do not grow this plant for its inflows. I personally have always chopped off inflows on this Alocasia cuprea in the last 5 years. And if chopping off flowers makes your plant suffer, then I would love to see what she looks like when she's not suffering. So quite clearly, ultimately proof is in the pudding. So look, if cutting off the inflows definitely did not hurt this plant. She's loving it, she's happy. Could the plant have grown another leaf instead if I would have not chopped them off? Maybe. Maybe the plant would have grown less leaves if I wouldn't have chopped off the inflows. I'm ultimately not too sure, but usually when you find such opposing information online, what it means is that both are just fine. Do whatever you feel more comfortable with. If you feel comfortable chopping them off, go for it. Clearly works. If you're not comfortable chopping them off and you'd rather see them, then don't. That is also okay. At the end of the day, it's not a competition. Definitely not a competition on speed. You will get there eventually. As long as you give the plant the right conditions and you care for it appropriately. I don't think your inflorescence management strategy is really going to be the deciding factor over here. But I still wanted to address it because yes, it happens all the time. And it can be frustrating because you want this plant to grow another leaf, not another inflow. So I fully feel your pain, and I get pissed off when the plant just throws out inflow after inflow after inflow. But what we can do is we can just multi-plant so that even if one of the plants is growing an inflow, maybe the other one isn't. Plus then we also have more leaves, right? So I mean, I didn't multi-plant this, but by now it multiplied itself, so it looks so lush because there's like 5, 6, 7 plants actively growing. So if one of them is just growing inflow after inflow, I couldn't care less. Alrighty, and then lastly, I don't think you can see this anymore, so let me get my phone out yet again. While this plant is not a climber, I do have a garden stake in here. That garden stake is not necessarily, where does it start? Here. That is not necessarily to give the plants support. I mean by now a little bit. I think if it wasn't for the garden stake, that main shoot would have already snapped itself because it's so heavy. But the idea behind that garden stake is that I tie the petioles to the garden stake to create this nice display. Now you can see I haven't done this in a hot minute. All of these petioles over here are not part of this tying up. But what I have done instead is I changed the location of light. Before I gave it its own grow light over there, it was actually relying on natural light. Natural light usually comes through via a window, which means it comes in from the side. So my plant was facing one side very heavily and almost being a little bit droopy. So then the stake helped me put the leaves upright, make it a little bit more compact. I think the light exposure coming from above naturally helps that plant be a little bit more upright, but might not be a bad idea to just incorporate all of these into the next iteration of managing these leaves. There's no right or wrong here. Just I take a piece of twine because twine is nice and soft, and I take a petiole to the garden stake, next petiole to the garden stake, or petiole to garden stake. I just make it up on the day depending on what I want the plant to look like in the end, depending on how well the petioles are cooperating and so on. Just play around a little bit until you find the end result pleasing. Top tip is incorporate the garden stake at the next time of repotting. So you're not having to slam that garden stake in and potentially hurt roots and or the rhizome later on. You might not need the garden stake at the time of repotting, but you know, future you will thank you for it already being there. Do this to create a nice compact display that I find visually pleasing. I don't do that because the Alocasia's leaf naturally droop. I mean, you saw this plant over here. They're not droopy, but I see droopy leaves on Alocasias quite frequently. Now, from my experience, there isn't just one thing that could have happened to your Alocasia that causes droopy leaves. My first instinct would always be check the root system. If you have a healthy root system that can absorb water and nutrients, why would the plant be floppy and droopy, right? So it could have been overwatering and or underwatering that causes issues to the root system that ultimately then displays in the plant drooping its leaves. If on top of that you also see leaves yellowing, that's a pretty safe sign that there's something wrong with the roots. So I would check on the roots. Having a clear pot makes that so much easier, right? However, droopy leaves could also be a result of insufficient light. If your plant is also growing super long petioles but teeny tiny leaves, that's again a sign of insufficient light. So I don't think there's just this one answer for droopy alocasia leaves, but I would definitely check on the root system first. If the roots are healthy and it's still droopy, then it's most likely light. If the light is also not the issue, then it might be a lack of nutrients. A lack of nutrients might also display in your alocasia not holding any more than like 2 or 3 leaves. If the oldest leaf aborts every time a new leaf comes in, and as a result of that you're just always stuck in this perpetual cycle of having 2 or 3 leaves on your alocasia, it is probably because the plant doesn't have enough nutrients available to actually support more than just these 2 or 3 leaves. So provide more nutrients. Alrighty, I think that is pretty much all I know about this plant, and hopefully this video enables you to replicate my success with Alocasia cuprea so that you can also grow this beautiful beast at home. I'm definitely lucky that I live in Sydney, apart from a few months in winter where I need to supplement heat and the fact that my house is super dark, so I need to supplement with light. I'm fairly lucky when it comes to the conditions, so I can really just focus on the care. But if you're in a different part of the world, that might look different to you. So in the comments down below, as a community, let's help each other out growing Alocasia cuprea successfully. So leave a comment with your success, your tips and tricks. Might be helpful for other people, for you to also let them know whereabouts you are, so they know whether or not, you know, maybe your tip is relatable or not. Also, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel and click the bell notification so that next time I upload a spotlight video, you'll get a notification. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you very soon. Bye.